That statement that in order to create the Africa we want, we have to create the church that God wants, was based on an analysis of two things. An analysis of the AU 2063 vision, which is entitled The Africa We Want. And so we were examining the role of the church in the Africa that the African Union wants. And that Africa has a lot of material aspirations, but it does not factor in the spiritual foundations of the development of Africa. And we know that the church plays an incredible role in what shapes Africa. And so we have seen a lot of material, financial, academic input into Africa. But the question is, why has Africa not taken that leap forward? Obviously, there has to be an answer outside of what the African Union is looking at. And for us, it is the church. It is the church that must unlock that potential, that must unlock that vision. And so we can never get the Africa we want unless we get the church that we want, because a lot of potential and talent and vision is locked up in the constituency of the church. Well, developing a Joseph strategy, you've got to look at the life of Joseph. And there are 5 elements there in the life of Joseph that we are going to have to look at, besides the fact that he was the youngest. Okay, and so therefore, if we're going to go into the Africa we want, we have to be using the next generation to be able to take us there. And that's exactly what happened with Joseph. Joseph was where I come from, we call him the second firstborn. Now, the firstborn was Reuben. The second firstborn was Joseph. They came from 2 mothers. And it was the second firstborn. It is this other generation that is going to usher us into a transformation. But that generation needs to have 5 things that are very clear. They need to have a clear vision of what the future looks like, which Joseph had. They are going to have to get their priorities right, priorities in testing. They are going to have to learn to serve and not just get. And that is what Joseph learned to do in Potiphar's house. He had to learn to serve. He was the blue-eyed, boy of his father. But when he got to Potiphar, he was a servant. And that is one thing that is important for the church, for us to learn to do. Prioritize other people's needs. Prioritize building something bigger than ourselves. The 4th one was that he had to learn to be a prophet in training. And by prophet in training, it meant that he had to learn to make other people's dreams come true before his own came true. And sometimes in Africa, there is a preoccupation with self, with propagating your own way, issues around corruption, which have something to do with me, myself, and I. But Joseph in prison had to learn to interpret the dreams of others. It speaks about a generation that knows how to collaborate, how to work, how to synergize, in order for me to succeed, I must ensure that you succeed. I cannot make it on my own, as the African proverb says. If I want to go fast, I go by myself. If I want to go far, I have to go with others. So this next generation, they're already doing it. They're already doing it on Facebook, on Google, collaborations across. We have got to harness that in the church and take it forward. And then finally, I think it's important to have power in teamwork. When Joseph became the vice president or prime minister, he brought his other brothers on board. We will never be able to impact Egypt unless we bring other brothers on board. He brought everybody to Egypt, set them up in Goshen, and that's how the nation of Israel effectively was born. The issue is that part of the problem we have is we have a church that is in a community but not impacting the community. So the church, in a sense, has become a monastic entity. It only operates within the 4 walls of a church, within the confines of a denomination, within some kind of program. And in that sense, it has failed essentially to be the salt and light. So salt only works when it is outside of the salt shaker, and it works inside of a person. Light only works when there's darkness in an environment. And so the church must begin to measure its power and presence not on Sundays only. It must begin to measure by what it does in a community. We are measuring the wrong things. We are measuring how many people come to church, how much money we have, what kind of profile we have, the profile of our senior pastors and so on, instead of measuring the impact that the church is having in a community. There is this oxymoronic dilemma in Africa that you have huge numbers of Christians with very little transformation in corruption, in politics, in economics, in poverty. So how does that work? How do you have a growing church in Nigeria and yet the indications are going wrong? In Kenya, in Zimbabwe, where I come from. And yet that constituency is not exerting a powerful transformative power on communities. So the church must revisit how it defines its functions and how it produces disciples. It must produce people who operate outside of the four walls of the church. It must produce marketplace disciples, people who are going to go out there and be the salt and be the light wherever they may be. That's the only way we can impact Africa and produce the kind of Africa we want. The church has an amazing potential. I'll give you a couple of things. Demographically, we are huge in Africa south of Sahara or the Sahara. We are big. Islam may, at the most, maybe constitute 25% of the population and the demographics of Africa. But the rest of Africa, by and large, is Christian. That kind of influence already, just demographically, is huge. The numbers of young people who are in the church are amazing. The growth of the church, and statistically this has been looked at, the growth of the church globally will be greater in Africa than in any other because of the demographic, the population growth we have. If we could harness that, if we could use that, we would make an incredible impact, not just now, but in the future. If you look at the number of Christians who are in business, who are in politics, who are in some kind of marketplace position of prominence, it's incredible. We have people in parliament, we have people in global corporations, we have people at community level. That kind of influence can be leveraged. It can be harnessed to make an impact for the church. By the church, I don't mean a particular church. I mean the kingdom. And we need to have that kind of mindset, a kingdom mindset, rather than just a denominational or church mind. We have huge assets in terms of people. We have huge assets in terms of leverage, in terms of our geographical spread. The church in Africa can be in the smallest nook and cranny you can think of. Can you imagine the reach? If we reach that nook and cranny with a kind of the correct doctrine, the correct perspective, the correct means of engagement, we can change the smallest little village and the biggest city you can think of. So I think there's an amazing power that is within the church, which we have not realized or which we have not released, like the rod of Moses. What's that in your hand? We are not aware of what we have in our hands. First of all, kingdom cannot be kingdom without the king. And therefore, it's important that if we are going to transform an Africa into the kind of Africa we want, the King of Kings must be at the helm of this Africa. The church must be very powerful, very purposeful in ensuring that the King of Kings is at the center. Unfortunately, many times, that profile of the King of Kings is being contested by other profiles, by whether it's a personality profile, a church profile, or a racial profile, ethnic profile. All of those things must be subordinated to the profile of the king. When we do that, we will create one powerful force called unity of focus. The unity of focus must be around the king. If we can all merge our agendas, our perspectives for the upliftment of the King, who is Jesus Christ, we will move Africa from division and fragmentation to unity. I think that is very important. The other thing that I think is important is the ability to bring synergy and working together. Whether it's in the church, I'm president of AEA, and therefore I'll start with the church. I think we waste a lot of energy with fragmentation and division. I think if we're to build the kind of Africa we want, the church must model unity. It must model working together. It must model synergy. And when that happens, the communities in Africa will begin to do that. I think another very important element of the kind of Africa we want is an Africa that is developing its resources, but also compassionate. I think it's important. I think sometimes we have development that leaves people behind. We need to bring those two together. We need to bring prosperity, which is people-oriented. We need to bring economic development, which does not leave behind social development. And if we can do that, we will deal with a lot of issues around poverty, a lot of issues around isolation, a lot of issues around the fragmentation of communities. So that's the kind of Africa that we see. And then finally, I think that it will be the kind of Africa that will be a global player and not just a global receiver of donations. And Africa has received the highest amount of donations from donors, and yet we have not moved forward. I think Africa will find its position where it is a player, where it is a contributor at a global level rather than just a receiver and a victim. That narrative needs to change. We need to project an Africa that has found its place amongst the continents of the world and is contributing, and there's a profile that is well and strong and healthy and respected. This particular one, the one thing that I've noticed, and of course it sort of pains me a little bit, is that there are not many pastors in this conference. There are a lot of marketplace people. But what we need to do is to bring the two together. We need to do what Joseph did. Joseph, there are only two people that Joseph kept in prison in Egypt. It was Reuben, his older brother, and Benjamin, the youngest. We need to bring those two elements together so that they talk to one another, the marketplace people and the pulpit people. Exactly what happened at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There were two people that facilitated the resurrection. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a counselor, a politician, and a business person, and Nicodemus was a rabbi and a priest. Those two people collaborated in order to facilitate the next dimension of the resurrection of the body of Jesus Christ. That collaboration, which I can see here, needs to grow. And for me, I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by the practicality that has been brought here, the spirituality that has been brought here. But what we need to do is to increase the synergy and collaboration between the marketplace people and the church pulpit people like myself. Thank God I managed to bridge the two, but I'm a rare species here. So I would like to see more of our pastoral, church-oriented people coming here and making that mindset transformation. The scourge of corruption in Africa is a byproduct of 3 or 4 things that I think can be dealt with. One, certainly it is a byproduct of poor leadership. If we are going to deal with it, we are going to have to deal with leadership issues at whatever level, at community level, church level, at government level. It's a leadership issue. Number 2, it is a governance level issue. We are going to have to deal with the way our governments or government institutions or governance rather, institution rather than government, anything that governs people, how it is instituted. Africa is very poor at creating functional institutions that are independent from persons or from politics. We are going to have to work at very strong institutions that have a watchdog strength in them. I think that is very important. The third element is we are going to have to empower our people to be able to speak out on issues that are incorrect or wrong or corrupt. And many times in Africa, we have created a culture of compliance rather than a culture of speaking up. We have created a culture which is risk averse rather than taking risk. I think the church, amongst other players, can empower people to be able to speak out and be empowered to be owners of the processes that are happening in our communities. We are too quiet sometimes, and the church, in that sense, has not helped. Thirdly, I think it is important for Africa to embrace technology. Technology will take out the middleman, and the middleman is the one who brings in corruption. If I don't have to go through someone, a counselor or whatever, to make an application for land or whatever, I'm not involved in any corrupt activity. So we are going to have to embrace technologies that help us transact business a little faster and more transparently. So I think that is very, very important. And then finally, it's a political thing. We are going to have to change the way the priorities of politics are about. The priorities of politics are usually about power rather than people. They are about sections and segments of people making headway rather than everybody. The politics of Africa is very skewed. It is very power-oriented, very partisan-oriented, and very personality-driven. We are going to have to change that if we are going to rid Africa of the scourge of corruption. I think what will be required to move Africa from disharmony to harmony is a common vision of what God wants Africa to be. I think in a nutshell, that's what a common vision of what Africa ought to be. In Zimbabwe, we did a document called The Zimbabwe We Want, and it started with the vision. As the church, we came up with a common vision. What do we want? What do we want to see? Before we talk about how we do it, let's first of all visualize it, which is what I spoke about when I was talking about Joseph. He had a vision of what he wanted. Let's have a common vision. Let's have a clear common vision of what the Africa we want. When we rally around that, we will find ways of working together. We'll find ways of overcoming differences and disagreements. We have to have a common vision that will bring a common unity for Africa to move from disunity to a common forward front to change the future